Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. In this episode, you're listening to a timely and practical safety roundtable discussion focused on the UK health and safety legal landscape as we head into 2026. I'm joined by Keith Mathews, Legal Director at HCR Law, who specialises in insurance, risk and regulatory matters, and regularly advises organisations navigating serious health and safety incidents and enforcement action. Across this conversation, we unpack what's really changing, not so much in the legislation itself, but in how it's being enforced. Keith shares clear insights into the HSE's current mindset, why prosecution is increasingly favoured over persuasion, and what recent cases tell us about where organisations are still falling short. We explore recurring themes such as basic risk management failures, the growing scrutiny on directors and senior leaders, and why task-specific risk assessments, effective supervision, and demonstrable governance now matter more than ever. We also dig into longer-term and less visible risks, including occupational health, mental health, chronic exposure, and the legal insurance implications of getting these wrong. Importantly, this isn't just a legal overview. It's a strategic discussion about defensibility, governance, culture, and what boards and senior leaders should be prioritising now if they want to be in a strong position going into the year ahead. So if you're responsible for safety, risk, compliance, HR, ops, or insurance, this episode will give you a clearer picture of what good really looks like in the eyes of regulators and where the real risks are hiding. Let's get into the conversation.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thank you everybody for joining us today on the Safety Roundtable, the last Safety Roundtable of 2025. We've covered lots of topics this year, but we're going out with a bang, with a really value-packed session with my guest today, Keith Mathews. I'll ask Keith to introduce himself in a second. We're going to be talking about the health and safety legal landscape and trying to give you guys a bit of an overview, I suppose, in terms of some of the trends that have been happening over the last 12 months, talking about some of the cases that we've seen, prosecutions, etc., and thinking about where things are going into 2026, which we will obviously be in very, very soon. So what I'll do, Keith, I will quickly stop sharing. I'll ask you to just quickly say hello, and then we can pull up your slides. So thank you for joining me, firstly.
Yeah,
quick intro.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for inviting me, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to everyone joining the call. Appreciate it's a busy time of the year before Christmas, so I hope you find today's session valuable. In terms of my background, I'm Keith Mathews. I'm a legal director at HCR Law and in the insurance risk and regulatory team. And so today we're talking about health and safety.
Fantastic. Thank you, Keith. And just as a disclaimer, and just to be clear, we're not here to give any free legal advice. So anything Keith talks about today is opinion rather than formal advice. And if you have any questions, obviously Keith's going to be very happy, as always, on the Safety Roundtable to take questions, but hopefully nothing too specific, because he'll just say, well, we need to look into that and so on and so forth. So with that, over to you, Keith. Give us a bit of an update as to where we are and what's been going on.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Christian. So I thought I'd prepare a few slides today. So hopefully this will be 20, 25 minutes. I'll try and cover this off as quickly as I can, because I appreciate people want to ask some questions. Christian, yourself, you might have some questions for me as well, as may others. So we can have plenty of time for that. As you can see, the title of this is Health and Safety Legal Landscape Update. Christian, if you can go to the next slide, I'd be grateful. Yeah, so A brief background to this. As we all know, we operate in one of the most structured, mature OHS markets globally. The key point I'd really say in terms of what we've been seeing, and the key part of this slide really I'll focus on, is the enforcement trends, which we believe the HSE seem to be focusing on. And there's 4 points there, and I'll cover each in a little bit more detail. The first one is persistent failures in basic risk management. A lot of this might sound obvious, but things such as, from what we are seeing in terms of trends, as poor risk assessments, for example, tick box or generic ones, inadequate control measures, also potentially weak leadership, safety culture, and poor training and competence as well. And as well, whilst on paper it might say people are monitoring or supervising a task, for example, not seeing it in practice is a very different scenario, of course. Another trend we're seeing is long-term occupational health risks. These encompass things as musculoskeletal disorders, work-related stress and depression, occupational lung diseases from asbestos, COPD from dust, fumes or chemicals, and potentially skin diseases from chemicals. So these are sort of issues we do see. There's also emerging hazards as well to be aware of. This is arising from how work is designed, managed and experienced. Things such as workload, too much workload, long hours, not enough staff, unrealistic targets, expectations, poor work-life balance, potentially workplace bullying, harassment, and poor management and leadership. And these are sort of issues that the HSE are clamping down on as much as possible. And then finally, chronic exposure risks, and I've put in brackets there, noise, dust and asbestos. They're kind of probably obvious ones to everyone on the call. But for example, on noise, continuous exposure to machinery, tools, so that sort of thing leads to potential issues in the long-term future. So I think the key point really from this slide, they're the 4 points that we are seeing in terms of the enforcement trends, but also health and safety must be treated as a core governance obligation. And that's the key point really, and not just an operational function. It is very, very, very important. Christine, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, please, I'd be grateful. I thought I'd provide a few statistics. The HSE recently have provided their statistics, which encompasses the below. I've put some key points on there. I won't go through everything, single one, but as you can see, there's still over 120 workers, unfortunately, that were fatal incidents at work in the last year. Probably no surprise, falls from height remain a very serious issue when it comes to fatal injuries, and might come to some people's surprise, but nearly 23 billion is lost due to workplace injury and ill health, and for just over 40 million working days lost due to work-related injury. So the impact it has, not just in health and safety for organisations, and also for the economy is enormous. And getting these things right and improving this will only have benefits for everyone. Next slide, please, Christian. So back to what I was saying earlier about the enforcement trends and behaviours. There is a continued emphasis now on prosecutions rather than persuasion. So traditionally, HSE in the past may have provided a lot of advice and guidance on certain situations, but there's a lot more prosecutions for obvious reasons, mainly for accountability, to deter organisations to take it seriously, and also there's also an expectation from the public and legally as well that things are clamped down on, to set an example and ensure these and try and avoid these sort of incidents in the future. The key point from the top stats there is you can see it's a very, very high conviction rate. And HSE, when they generally do look to prosecute, they will have their evidence ready to push forward with this. And you can see as we know, there's been, since the sentencing guidelines a number of years back, fines have increased dramatically, and there's a lot more enforcement notices. So that's the behaviour and that's the trend we're seeing from the HSC. As you can see, this reflects low tolerance for admin failures, huge expectations around documentation, supervision, training, like I alluded to earlier, and increased focus on management systems and not just frontline behaviour. And for obvious reasons, I'm part of the insurance team as well. D&O cover could be affected. Cover, there could be issues following prosecutions, and then for obvious reasons, EL and PL premiums could drive up significantly if organisations don't get it right. Next slide, Christian, please. Thank you. I thought I'd cover over, there's a number of cases from the HSC, as we may have all seen over the last number of years, but I thought I'd focus on a couple I've seen recently, actually, recently and certainly this year. The top case there was a fine of £600,000. Unfortunately, the employee was fatally injured when the employee trapped under a falling pallet. And it was something as simple as they failed to carry out a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. And on this particular case, they didn't feel that the task in hand was properly risk assessed, and therefore the resulting fine was enormous, especially with the seriousness of what occurred. There's another enormous fine towards the bottom, nearly just approximately 800,000. Where unfortunately a 17-year-old apprentice fell through inadequately supported flooring at a construction site. A bit more background on that: the accident occurred when timber boards over joists collapsed because they were not back propped as required, and unfortunately the apprentice was left with very, very serious injuries. And again, things weren't in place that the organisation could have done to have avoided this incident. Christian, next slide, please. And I've covered over a few more examples from, as you can see, there's 3 more examples here. All 3 actually are very, very recent. And the top one in particular has quite an enormous fine, close to 200,000. Again, involving another apprentice still learning how to operate machinery, when the apprentice's arm was pulled in, and unfortunately there was inadequate training and failure to isolate moving parts, which could have avoided the incident from the HSE's perspective. The second one down, there was also, thought I'd highlight, there was a director was also fined £1,000 on top of the company. Again, worker fell approximately 30 feet, and failures included lack of planning, supervision and risk assessment. And then finally, there was a crush injury in another recent example. It was deemed that there was no safe system of work or guarding, and then there was another fine in that respect. And then key legal pattern, and we've highlighted at the bottom, it's worth reiterating: courts are consistently rejecting arguments that incidents were one-offs or due to worker error where systemic failures exist. So that's something to just be aware of. When there's system failures, there's going to be more likelihood of prosecution and success. Next slide, please, Christian. Key points really following on from the sort of prosecutions that we've seen over the last 6 to 12 months in particular. Risk assessments must be task specific. As I've said, generic or template assessments are routinely criticised. No big surprise there. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Make sure it's task specific, because it is extremely important to make sure just by having the tick box exercise done is not going to be good enough. You need to ensure that it is related to the actual task itself. Training alone, again, is not a defence. A similar sort of point, that just because you've done training doesn't mean you've got a defence. It's the quality of the training. Are you monitoring that? Are you supervising it? Are you enforcing it? Are you making changes to the training? That sort of thing. And is the training good enough to ensure that the risk is low? And then again, no leniency based on size or sector. Courts emphasise, it's quite a key point, proportionality, not immunity. And this we've seen in terms of a wider enforcement trend. And then final point on this is directors are definitely getting increasingly scrutinised. We've just seen a case where a director's fined £1,000. Failure to resource safety properly can lead to personal penalties as well. And that's another key focus for the HSC. Next slide, please, Christian. And in terms of, so beyond this point, we are seeing civil claims, long tail liability and occupational disease. Recent courts, things such as mesothelioma and asbestos exposure related cases, liability triggered at time of exposure and usually decades away. And that's something that's always of a concern, not just from a reserving point of view, but also for insurance impact, obviously, but also as to what the exposure could be. There's also prior settlements may not extinguish future claims. There was a case of Robert Crozier in 2018, for example, where Robert had brought a claim for asbestos-related issues and later on developed mesothelioma a number of years later, and the family brought a claim for that. But there was an argument that because there was a claim previously that was the end of it, but that was successful. And I mean, courts will look at it on a case-by-case basis. It doesn't mean just because you settle something that it doesn't expose you in the future eyes or potentially. Next slide, please, Christian. Yeah, so key legal and oh, sorry, 1 second, apologies, I've lost my screen. I'm back. Key legal and regulatory changes for next year, we would say, if not already. Data privacy and cybersecurity. I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to everyone on the call. GDPR enforcement is very aggressive. There's health and safety data often includes sensitive personal data, so ensure that you are very careful with that. ESG integration, again, worker safety and wellbeing is increasingly forming part of ESG, and obviously health and safety records can now affect investment, financing, and insurance terms. So those sort of things to bear in mind. There's also the employment law reforms that will also have an impact. And then goes without saying, AI and digital regulation, in particular with AI tools on risk assessments, claims handling, underwriting decisions, making sure that any use of AI is correctly used. And we will see probably in the next number of years, especially the way AI is being integrated into society and how fast-tracked it has been the last couple of years, and no doubt it will get more so towards the end of the decade. The over-reliance on AI with making sure that risk assessments are accurate, claims handling, underwriting, and ensuring that you are alive to the potential issues that can arise from this. Next slide, please. So yeah, in terms of boards, senior leaders, so governance expectations, boards are expected, no surprise here, to treat health and safety, as I've said earlier, as a core governance issue. That is extremely important because it is seen as pivotal to how an organisation is run, and that's how it should be treated. Always ensure policies are actively implemented and reviewed. For example, I've seen many policies that when we represent organisations, the policy has not been updated for a number of years. So it might have been valid and adequate at the time, maybe 5-6 years ago, but the fact that it's not been done for that period of time, things have changed. They're using different instruments. Those sort of things you can get caught out on if you're not keeping up to date and reviewing it, ensuring it's accurate. And then maintain up-to-date regulatory knowledge as well, as much as possible. We've got access, as we know, to so much more information than we had in the past, but just keeping alive to potential issues out there, even what the HSC are prosecuting, for example, because there might be things that might spell an alarm bell, go, oh, we probably need to look at that risk assessment, or we need to look at something to try and keep an eye on. Failures can result in the below: regulatory, prosecution, shareholder actions, directors and officers' insurance exposure, and last but not least, reputational damage, impacting your insurance capability. And very, very important point, delegation as well. When you delegate tasks out to other organisations, does not remove responsibility, even though it might be assumed it does. Next slide, please, Christian. So I thought it'd be useful to have a look at some high-risk areas that could be overlooked potentially. Cyber incidents involving safety systems or employee data, as we've alluded to, very, very important, especially in the world we're in now, to ensure that these are accurate and up to, you've got as much systems as you can in place to try and combat what's out there. Mental health risks, I know that and it comes onto the slide later, whilst, as you can see there's a stat showing that stress, depression, anxiety has fallen a little bit, but it is very, very significant still. And it is something that everyone needs to be alive to. There's a lot more stress, burnout, bullying cultures that need to really be addressed. Discrimination and harassment, again, that's another area, as I've alluded to earlier, that needs to be considered. And then poor documentation, essentially a bit like not having the up-to-date documentation, but making sure that any documentation you have, just because you've got documentation and you think you've complied, make sure you review that documentation, make sure you review that training, make sure you review the risk assessments, make sure you review your supervision. Is that accurate? Is that representing the task in hand? Have things changed in the last year or two? That can be heavily scrutinized if something bad happens. And so what you want to be doing is making sure that you have safe systems in place to ensure, and documentation to back those sort of situations up. Next slide, please, Christian. And yeah, so what good looks like. And then in terms of demonstrating good due diligence, those sort of things, like live reviewed risk assessments, i.e. kept up to date, clear audit trails. Again, that would demonstrate that you are on top of things. Board level oversight is shown that it's a key governance point, and the board are taking it very, very seriously. Anonymous whistleblowing systems as well. That is very, very important, especially in the current world we're at, where if people feel like they can't go to someone, or they feel like they might have an issue with their job, with their manager, or if they can't go somewhere else. And that, again, those sort of systems in place are very important for employees to say how they feel about something. And then regular insurance policy reviews aligning to emerging risks. And as I've alluded to earlier, the emerging risks are probably the biggest one is, well, there's emerging risks with mental health, that sort of thing, but AI in particular is a huge one in terms of ensuring that is used accurately and as safely as possible. Again, the legal advantage, strong evidence in this regard can reduce sentencing, support mitigation arguments, and influence insurer responses to claims as well. So, next slide, please. Sorry, please, Christian. And then I think this, forgive me, Christian might tell me after I've done this slide, it's not the last slide, but I think this is the last slide. So some key messages really. Fatal and serious incidents continue to arise from basic compliance failures. So again, that's something, so a lot of this, not every single thing can be avoided, but a lot of things can be avoided by having good systems in place and ensuring your documentation and supervision are up to speed. There's clear occupational health risks, especially with what I've discussed earlier. HSE expectations around documentation, supervision and governance are rising. So as I've discussed in this call, having all these areas in the best possible place if an incident or an issue occurs kind of gives you the best chance of mitigation or defending these sort of claims as best as possible. Equipment and machinery safety, you've seen in one or two of the cases that always challenge and ensure that these are as safe as possible and the systems used are accurate. Mental health, as I alluded to earlier, is firmly becoming a wider issue, I'd say, and it's something that all organisations are alive to, of course, but it's ensuring that you have got that firmly in hand. And then finally, really from a legal and insurance perspective, we would always advise that health and safety must be treated as a continuous improvement exercise. Board level governance issue, I know I've said that a few times, but very, very important, and a critical risk management function to essentially reduce as much risk as possible for the organisation and business to hand. So, like I said, that was a very quick whistle-stop tour on a bit of a HSE update, and I kind of hope it was helpful for everyone.
Thank you, Keith. That was great. I didn't want to interrupt your flow by asking you questions, but there've been a few questions in the chat, and I've got a few questions myself for you. So hopefully we can ask you questions that you can answer rather than giving you two difficult ones.
Sure.
So if we think about the last few years, the legislative framework hasn't massively changed, I don't think, but there seems to have been a shift in terms of enforcement. So what's kind of changed in the last maybe couple of years in terms of the mindset of the HSE and councils who are enforcing this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's the deterrent that I think there's a lot of things in the legal and public eye at the minute. I think a lot of people want to see action being taken by the HSC. We're in a very social media dominated environment. If things are not looking like that it's been scrutinised and dealt with appropriately, people might have concerns as to, well, how are these organisations being dealt with if something very serious happens, especially a fatal incident or life-changing injuries, as we've seen earlier, especially with young apprentices. And there was a couple of cases there where you've got to treat, I mean, training's got to be appropriate for everyone, but especially when you've got new apprentices on the job who are literally out of school, have very limited experience, and you've got to limit, you've got to understand that, those sort of instances need that sort of supervision and training and, sort of thing. But there is a lot more appetite from the HSC to prosecute, and they do have a very high success rate.
They certainly do. Yeah, they don't seem to take on the case if they don't think they're going to win it, in my experience.
No. Well, yeah, it's very unusual for them to fail.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that we've moved, based on a couple of things you said, we've moved from a system that kind of tolerated gaps to one that is actually maybe even looking for gaps and looking for those little points of weakness from a prosecution perspective?
Sorry, can you repeat? I didn't hear that. My line just went dead a bit.
Oh, so just saying, is it fair to say we've moved from a system that kind of tolerated gaps to one that's actually actively hunting for them?
Yes, I would say so. I think it's very important to, really from our point of view, so from our perspective, you want to do everything you can to demonstrate if there's an issue or an incident, because not everything's avoidable. You want to be ensuring that you have everything possible to mitigate or defend a claim or a case against yourselves if there is anything. So you want to make sure that you are up to date on the risk assessments, training, the supervision, the monitoring, also challenging anything like if you contract someone to look at something, like I've alluded to earlier, by delegating doesn't mean your responsibility is over. You need to ensure that you are, you have any missing gaps are filled in and ensure that they are as safe as possible to demonstrate that there's a history that you can show that you did everything possible to avoid an incident or a situation.
Yeah. And if you were briefing a board, let's say around 2026 versus 2023 or 2024, what would be the kind of key difference, now versus then?
Yeah, good question. I think one thing I would say that we've seen is identify, for example, where shortcuts are normalized. So, for example, where reporting is discouraged or production pressures override safety and compliance. So those sort of things that you may not be aware of, but the board needs to try and get a grip on. I would also invest in targeted development for senior leaders and managers in particular, focus on risk understanding to ensure that the ground staff and the managers in particular are sufficiently trained to spot issues, spot risks, and to report it back and deal with it, and the board can deal with it appropriately. I also would suggest move beyond dashboards and policy statements by actively testing whether critical controls and reporting systems are actually working in practice. That would be something else I would say. Just because you got it on paper doesn't mean that that's enough. And the HSE are challenging those sort of situations where you haven't got it, where it might look good on paper, but does it actually work in practice? And those sort of things, I would say, would be very important going into the next year.
Yeah, thanks for that, Keith. There's a question here from Nick in the chat, who I know works in the kind of road safety space. Why won't the HSE take on a road incident case when it's involved driving for work, as they would do with an on-site injury or fatality? Seems to be something that doesn't happen based on what Nick's seeing. Disappointing, especially if there are multiple deaths or injuries involved. Why is it the transport industry are made to run a tighter regulations on mobile device interaction, for example, in driving for work?
Yes, so I'm just pulling the question up as well just to see it. I think it's down to the regulator, and I think it's the transport industry. What you make is a good point, but it's something that would have to change really from the top as to why they don't do that. I think they focus more on what we've discussed earlier, and the transport industry kind of focus on that. But I understand your point about it being disappointing because maybe there can be more effect it may have long term on the way people drive, the way you think, on maybe the incidents coming down and the fatalities in particular, especially on multiple injuries and deaths. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks. If anyone else has got any further questions for Keith, then type them in the chat, or feel free, if you're on Zoom with us, to raise your hand and I'll call you up and you can come and chat as well. One of the things that I particularly struck me in what you were saying was the point around that kind of one-off, this was a one-off, honest gov. And I feel like that is something that people would often say, whether they really believe it or whether that's more of a defensive mechanism. What then actually convinces a court that a failure is systemic rather than a one-off incident or a piece of human error? Well, I mean, naturally, when you come to defend a claim such as that, where you might be deemed a one-off, especially if you end up in a court situation, from a defence point of view, we will probably be we act generally from a defence angle. We would be looking to look at the systems in place, what the organisation has done to try and prevent this sort of incident, which may be a one-off, and that might be an argument we try and use. However, that's not accepted really, because you want to be demonstrating that you've done everything you can, like I've alluded to earlier, that to mitigate those risks by having all these systems in place, everything up to date as viable as possible. Also, I mean, one thing probably I should touch on is where organisations sometimes make a mistake. So you might have great policies so it's a big organisation, many offices around the country, for example, and the policies are great on paper, and there might be a belief that these are in practice, going in practice, but you might argue that there might be a rogue sort of, site that's not adhering to it. You've got to ensure that those policies are adhered to in every single site you have, for example. Ensure that it's being carried out there. By saying it's a rogue office or anything like that, it's not going to be tolerated, because if that was tolerated, it'd be very unusual for a court to agree with that, because then it would be seen that there's precedents out there for organisations to get out of serious incidents potentially. So I think the courts would steer clear of that if they could.
Yeah. So in your experience, is there quite a big gap between what an organisation might see as a defensible risk decision and what the HSE or what the court might accept as defensible?
Sorry, can you repeat that again? Apologies.
No, fine. Just wondered if in your experience, is there quite a big gap between what an organisation would see as a defensible risk position or decision and what the HSE or the courts would accept as defensible?
I think I wouldn't say there's, yeah, well, I mean, what we are seeing is a lot of basics are missed, unfortunately. So I think people think because they've got things down on organizations, and sometimes think from our experience that because they've got things on documents, that it means they've got control. When clearly, if it's not been maybe implemented or tested in a work environment, do those actual controls and measures work? Just because, don't just assume because you've got things in place, policies, are the policies right? Are they accurate? Who's challenging these policies? Who's updating them every year? And that's what courts will expect. And HSC will be challenging. In the past, it may have looked at that and gone, "Oh, it's great. The organisation's got X, Y, and Z." But now there's more of a focus on, well, what those documents actually mean. What does that mean in practice? And they're the sort of situations that we are encompassing as a problem at the minute, where they've not been tested properly, potentially, and it weakens our defence arguments.
Yeah. I remember interviewing a barrister on the podcast once, and he said that you're much better to have a very brief health and safety policy or document or risk assessment, but actually have the proof that you've done everything that you said, rather than having something that's kind of all singing, all dancing, and might be the best written document in the world, but you can't actually prove you've done it.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the thing. So if organisations have got all this detail, and I sometimes see that, but they've not tested it, then you're opening yourselves up to huge scrutiny as well. But it's not to say that you. But I know what the point you're getting at. It's not a two liner health and safety policy is a good thing,
No.
because obviously it's not really a policy, but it's from a barrister's point of view who ends up going to the hearing or arguing the points. It's makes his job slightly easier, but the outcome's still going to be very bad, I think, overall.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what you shared with the conviction rates of the HSE prosecutions, if you're at that point, then it's kind of damage limitation, I suppose, rather than hoping to be successful.
And it's the mitigation point. We want to be trying to, from a defence point of view, mitigating as best as possible, trying to avoid a court situation if we can, and trying to limit exposure for individuals or organisations, depending on how the HSC are looking to prosecute.
Yeah, no, definitely makes sense. Question from Gareth here. With mental health issues increasingly impacting the workplace, do you have guidance on how we can best prepare managers to be proactive, take action, and record actions?
Yes, I'm just looking at that question. I would say best prepare managers to be proactive, take action, record actions. I think depending on how big the organisation is and how, for example, here we have specific people that come in from the externally to train us as managers. For example, we manage teams as well to make sure that we are alive to these potential issues. So it's getting the right training in place from professionals to ensure that managers are prepared to actually, like you say, be proactive and take action, and not just assume that there's a bit of a generational culture as well, change, I would say, in terms of an expectation of what maybe people that have worked in the last 20, 30 years, for example, would expect in terms of work-life balance compared to what they did in the past, compared to what that maybe the younger generation would expect now. Things have moved on, things have changed, people have different priorities, things, there's a big working from home culture, but every organization's got a different sort of perspective on how they manage that, of course. But I would say just make sure that you've got the right professional sort of help in that regard. And I think always checking in with people as well. It's very important to have, and for people to be open as well, to say that you can get alive to these issues before they get signed off and there's a breakdown, or there's, stress, anxiety, that it's a silent sort of issue. And, it's just assuming that someone's not spoken up for a while, for example, doesn't mean that they're coping well. They might be getting on with it, but is it having an impact on their work-life balance, that sort of thing? It's very, very difficult. It's not an easy thing to manage. But again, from a business point of view, and make sure that you've taken the right steps to get the right training. If you may have that internally, and that's great. But if you don't, we'd always recommend professional support.
Yeah. Gareth, did you want to have a follow-up question?
Yes, once I work out how to unmute myself, Christian. Uh, Keith, thank you. Really
Yeah.
interesting information on the whole presentation there. You did mention there about the silent issue of mental health, um, which is very true. And really, so if we are starting on the route of being better at managing this, and it's really where do we start to record those conversations? That one-to-one conversation of, "Hey Keith, how's it going?
Yeah.
How's it going today? How's the weekend?" is really good, and we don't want to record those specific conversations. It's not.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
So where do we get into the bureaucratic side of it?
Yeah.
Of having that evidence where we go down the line and we've got these trigger points. That's not just what I think as a manager, but also aligning all managers in the business so that we're all working to the same sort of standard.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I think what you're getting at is like if people are having these conversations maybe weekly, for example, with their team, those conversations generally are not recorded, are they?
Yeah,
and I'd say that's probably the case here as well. Like even at law firms, from my experience, I can talk from that.
Yeah.
And that's an excellent point. What we do, for example, we have quarterly appraisals. Anything's always written down. We have 6-month and yearly appraisals as well. But there's also HR department. There's also constant training. We check in with people, and I think we probably take a common sense approach where I mean, if something's obvious, it's not always visible. That's like you saying, it's not visible.
Mm-hmm.
I think the concern would be is if someone's saying, "Yeah, I'm fine," but they're not actually fine, because a lot of like sometimes men in particular might say, "Yeah, I'm fine," and just move on, and then you assume they're fine, but they might actually be pride issues, might not feel they want to raise the issue, and
Yeah.
it's kind of I think you don't want to be spending so much time writing all these conversations down or anything. We don't do that as a law firm, for example, just from my own perspective. It's more we have it documented every quarterly, for example. And I think if there's people that I think it's having good managers aware of how to spot these issues, again, back to the professional training. So like I would say this just from the alarm bells, like for example, you see someone working at a weekend. Now it doesn't, sometimes you have to work it. Like we're Monday to Friday job, but we do work extra hours on weekends, unpaid, of course, because that's the way the job is, and that's kind of back to what I was saying, generational thing. It's what I was brought up with when I trained as a lawyer. That's never changed, deviated, but not every weekend or anything, but that's okay for some people and that's their choice. But for others, maybe the new generation, they don't want to be doing that, and that's fair enough and they're entitled to not to do that. But it's kind of making sure, can you spot those silent sort of points, i.e., it's not obvious, but you saw someone send you an email on Sunday night when they're meant to be working Monday, Friday, and then try and have those conversations. And then if you feel you need to go further with that, it's kind of just having that conversation with them and then recording it and then seeing if you can get them particular help. I think that's how I would approach it. I don't think there's a right or wrong to it, but again, you want to be demonstrating that. Have you got like appraisals in place to do that? And also, if people feel like they can't go to a manager, which would be another concern, is there another person that they can go to in the business that they feel, and even as an anonymous, to actually share those experiences and hopefully get help? I think those sort of things, again, would help, and also deal with the issues before you might have months and months of people out of the business and lose. And as we saw earlier in the slides, we not just as a business, but as an economy, we lose a lot in terms of financially, and the business does as well. And replacing those people long term, or if they're off for a long period, it puts more pressure on your own team. And again, that might have a knock-on effect with others. One individual's unfortunate issues might lead to might pile more work on others as well. So being alive to those issues as well. So they're the sort of things, that's how we approach it. And we always suggest it's usually HR people are meant to go to if they're not happy with something, or if they don't feel they can go to their manager, and it's meant to be done confidentially.
Yeah, that's great, Keith. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. But yeah, I accept it's a tricky thing, but I'd always make sure you have written evidence. I wouldn't be recording conversations every week. I'd just be making sure that the ones that your managers are able to pick up on those signs, and then you can have further conversations. That's what I'd recommend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith, and thanks, Gareth, for the questions as well. Just picking up on training, both in that context and more generally, it's something you mentioned in the slides, Keith.
Yeah.
What sort of on the basis of training alone not being enough, we need to do a bit more than that. So what kind of evidence would you recommend people gather to show that training actually was effective and actually changed behavior or was, it made a difference? It wasn't just training for tick box sake.
So for example, on risk assessments, reflect the actual work done. Look to revisit assessments after changes or near misses. Don't just assume because that. It's also important for organisations. Don't just wait for an incident. If there's a near miss or a few, we got away with that. For example, is there something wrong with the risk assessment? Does the training need to be changed? Look at the quality of the people you're bringing in. If you're doing it internally or externally, it doesn't matter. Look at the quality of the people and qualifications of the people that you're bringing in, or internally. Are they qualified enough to deliver that training appropriately? And then, because investigations they can focus on individual error sometimes as well, and system failure as well. But in terms of bridging. And did you say bridging gap as well? Sorry, forgive me.
Just in terms of, obviously, like doing training is good, but like, do we need to actually then be tracking the efficacy of that training? In other words, just saying we've got training is sort of level one, but actually that might not be enough on its own. What can we do to prove that we've actually done and implemented and improved the behaviours that the training was designed to achieve?
And training records, make sure you've got adequate paper documentation in that regard. And there's up-to-date training as well. Don't just do it once a year, maybe, depending on what the task is and what the issue is. Look at the guidance as well. There's a lot of guidance online, like I said earlier. Ensuring that it's competent training as well. Training for the sake of training is pointless. Is it task specific? There are certain trainings in, like, for example, I work in legal industry. We all have to go and do money laundering. It's all the same generally. But for example, the conveyancing team have a higher risk of money laundering than my team might have because they're dealing with huge transactions a day. And just because I've had the same training as the conveyancing team, for example, the property team, doesn't mean the property team is that enough for them. They may have to have another one because there's a lot more alarm bells they need to be aware of. And I think it's breaking it down for the areas of the business that are getting the training. And don't just make it generic for everyone. Do you need specific ones for little teams as well on top of that to make sure that you've covered yourself?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Keith. Last couple of questions from me, just conscious of time. So we've identified a few areas where there's room for improvement, but where would you say, on average, organisations are doing quite well in this space and should be praised? Where are we doing well?
I think what organisations, where I know I highlighted earlier that the most of the falls from height remains a leading cause of fatal injury. And it's because it's a serious risk and it's a visible risk. I mean, organisations I'd say, are strongest when the risk is visible and historically enforced. So yes, those sort of incidents can happen, but anything that's kind of out there that it's more obvious they are aware of. I think so. Those sort of scenarios, I would say, where it's visible, they can see, they are a bit more on it. But again, that's not every single organisation, of course. And those obvious risks is spotting like we've been chatting about, the risks that are a bit more hidden and silent, such as mental health, chronic exposure risk, that sort of thing. Are we on top of those, which could be the concern, really?
Yeah, that makes sense. And lastly, from me, if an organisation wanted to be, genuinely in a strong defensibility position going into 2026, what would be the 3 key areas you would prioritise on fixing first?
I know I've said it a few times, task-specific risk assessments is extremely important. I would also, we've been talking about training and the competency of those records linked to actual hazards as well, I would say. and maybe making it specific for certain teams if it needs to be as well, on top of overall training. And then I would also say evidence of management review and corrective action as well would be very, very important as well. Just because we've done it. And again, that reduces risk as well, because it shows that you're actually taking it seriously. You're showing it to be a core governance point for your business, and you are taking it very seriously. Not like we said, not everything is avoidable, but it's trying to reduce and mitigate your potential outcome there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Keith, thank you so much for that today. We covered a lot in 50 minutes, so really appreciate it. If people wanted to connect with you, where's a good way to do that? Is it LinkedIn, for example? And did you have anything you wanted to plug, any websites or any resources or any upcoming events or anything like that? Feel free.
Yeah, I mean, happy for anyone to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. It's Keith Mathews, as you can see in the name. A lot of people sometimes put 2 T's, but it's 1 T, Mathews. If anyone wants anything further, please reach out. We're an insurance risk and regulatory team as well, and we generally defend a lot of cases in the health and safety sort of sphere. And happy to have conversations if you feel there's any added value later on. Feel free to reach out. And also thank you to you, Christian, today for the opportunity to come and speak on this group.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And thanks to you for joining Keith and I today. And the last safety roundtable of this year, but we'll be back in January. And wishing everyone a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and all of that jazz in between now and then. So thanks very much for your support this year, and let's keep making the world safer and safer in 2026. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.